There's a lot of talk these days among Bible prophecy students concerning heavenly signs. But in fact, what are the signs that come just before what we call the end times begin? This is David Brennan with True Prophecy News. There's actually two specific signs that take place before the day of the Lord, which would be the end times, begins. And there's one heavenly condition that takes place during the time frame of the day of the Lord. And to understand the distinction is very important when studying Bible prophecy because it can get very confusing otherwise. So I'm going to go over that distinction by looking at some very specific scriptures. We're going to start off in the book of Joel, and we're going to take, Joel, we'll look at 2:30 and 2:31. In 2:30, we're told, "And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood, fire, and pillars of smoke." Verse 31, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes." So we are specifically told, not only in Joel, but those are also, both of those are also covered in Acts chapter 2, verses 19 through 20. Same wording. Two separate events, heavenly signs, are associated with the coming of the day of the Lord, and they apparently happened just before. In verse 30, "And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood, fire, and pillars of smoke," we don't exactly know what the wonders in the heavens are. We can speculate, but we don't specifically know. But what is interesting about that verse, about that particular warning before the day of the Lord begins, is that it's associated, these wonders in the heavens are associated with some type of notable war on the earth. And it must be notable because the scriptures are associating some war by the term, "and in the earth, blood, fire, and pillars of smoke," with these notable heavenly signs of wonders in the heavens. So the first indication, the first heavenly sign associated with the coming of the end times, which to my mind is the beginning of the day of the Lord, would be wonders in the heavens associated with a war on the earth. Now, what's the next sign? And this again comes before the day of the Lord begins. "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood," and it says specifically, before the great and terrible day of the Lord begins. So we're being told very specifically two signs that take place in the heavens before the day of the Lord begins. Wonders in the heavens associated with the war on the earth, and then the sun shall be darkened and the moon shall be turned into blood, also before the day of the Lord starts. Exactly what causes the sun to darken and what that is, we're not told. Is it possibly a solar eclipse, a notable solar eclipse? I guess that's possible. The blood moon, is that a lunar eclipse? Because it does turn the moon into what we call a blood moon. That's possible also. But we don't specifically know for sure what they are. We apparently will know after they unfold. But those are two heavenly signs that their distinction is that they come before the beginning of the day of the Lord. Now, here's where you can get tripped up. There's also a heavenly condition that takes place during the day of the Lord. And it impacts not just the sun and moon, which the warning signs before the beginning impact, but impacts the sun, moon, and stars. So before we get into those verses, let's take a look at why all three, the sun, moon, and stars, are impacted during the day of the Lord. And the answer is going to be, as we're going to see, is that there's a heavenly condition that envelops the earth during the day of the Lord. So let's start with Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 14. It's talking about the day of the Lord, and it says, "That day is a day of wrath," well, we know that, a day of trouble and distress, of course, a day of wasteness and desolation, and here's the key words, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. So we're seeing an actual celestial or heavenly condition during the day of the Lord, which is distinctly different from the signs before the day of the Lord. And if you don't understand that, when you study Bible prophecy, it's going to be very confusing when you get to heavenly signs. When we look at Isaiah 13:10, we see the result of this day of darkness, gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness in the atmosphere that Zephaniah talks about. This is what Isaiah says, chapter 13, verse 10. The stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Well, that certainly is the result of this day of thick clouds and darkness that Zephaniah describes as the day of the Lord. So that's the impact it has during the day of the Lord. It's a celestial or heavenly condition on the earth that is distinctly different. And the key to understanding that, as we'll see as we go further along, is that you'll see the sun, moon, and stars impacted during the day of the Lord, but the signs before the day of the Lord are confined to the wonders in the heavens, whatever those are, and the sun and the moon only being impacted. So why is the day of the Lord, as Zephaniah says, a day of such thick clouds and darkness? Let's check out what 2 Peter 3:10 says. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat, and the earth and the works that are therein shall be burned up. So certainly that could be the description of nuclear detonations going off. The day of the Lord is a time of great warfare. We talk about that in the World War III video, that it probably involves nuclear detonations. It is also possible that it's volcanic activity taking place. That could have essentially the same effect. All we know is there is some type of event happening in the atmosphere that creates a great noise, and elements will melt with a fervent heat, and the earth is getting burned up. That's what we know. We can only speculate on what causes it. Well, in addition to Zephaniah, the prophet Joel also talks about what type of a day the day of the Lord is concerning the atmosphere. And this is in Joel chapter 2, let's take a look at 1 through 3. Blow you the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in the holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord cometh, for it is nigh at hand. The day of the Lord has begun. Now a description similar to what Zephaniah gave us. A day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and of thick darkness. So there's clouds, there's thick darkness all over the place. And it goes into some more details in that verse. And then verse 3, it talks again what we saw in 2 Peter. A fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns the land, and so forth. So there's fire talked about. There's a day of clouds and thick darkness that apparently is caused by all the fires that are taking place during that time. So it's very important to note the distinction that during the day of the Lord, there's a celestial or atmospheric condition that develops, that we see based on Zephaniah and Joel, of thick darkness, that results in all three, the sun, moon, and stars, being impacted. So when you read verses and prophecies about the impact on the sun, moon, and stars, you're almost definitely reading about an event during the day of the Lord, okay? A little later in Joel chapter 2, verse 10, it talks about the earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. There's the impact on all three celestial bodies. Now let's take a look at Isaiah 13. Verse 6, it talks about, howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as destruction from the Almighty. Let's jump down to verse 10 now. For the celestial impact, for the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in its going forth. The moon shall not cause her light to shine. Again, we see all three. The sun, moon, and stars are impacted during the day of the Lord. Matthew 24, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, and we know during the day of the Lord there's great tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Well, the stars don't literally fall. The stars are like 1,000 times the mass of the earth. If one star fell on the earth, it would be gone, and yet the end times continue after this verse. So the earth continues. So it has to be a colorful phrase that's talking about the light of the stars disappear. Mark 13 references the same thing, that but in those days, this is 13:24, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and so forth. So again, it's reiterated that all three are impacted. Again, going back to Joel and Zephaniah, we see why. It's a day of thick darkness and clouds. We see it again in Revelation chapter 6. Verse 12, and I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth. Well, they, of course, didn't fall down on the earth because stars would destroy the earth. It's a colorful phrase to say the stars disappeared. And then you go down a few verses, verse 16, tells us it's the wrath of the Lamb. It says, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, or the wrath of God is the day of the Lord. For the great day of his wrath is come. Who shall be able to stand? So again, it's a reiteration that, the day of the Lord is the day of God's wrath, and so therefore, we're being told those things in that verse. Revelation chapter 8, and the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and a third part of the moon, and a third part of the stars. Now, certainly, the Lord could snap his fingers and make that happen, okay? But the point is, all three, during the day of the Lord, the wrath of God, are being darkened, impacted. So the point of this video is as follows. There's a distinction between the events, the celestial events that happen before the day of the Lord begins, and that is there'll be some type of wonders in the heavens associated with some notable war on the earth, and also the sun shall be darkened and the moon shall be turned to blood before it all begins, okay? During the day of the Lord, all three, the sun, moon, and stars, are impacted because it's a day of thick darkness. That distinction is very important to understand what you're reading and to put them in the proper context. So this is David Brennan with True Prophecy News. I hope you've enjoyed this video. And check out our website at trueprophecynews.com, where we have an array of articles and videos that you may find interesting. And if you haven't accepted Jesus Christ, I urge you to do so today. He is the only way to salvation. God bless.